Dear friends, colleagues, guests, and students, very glad that you come to attend today's lecture. We are very honored to have Professor Roger Ames here to deliver a lecture for us. Probably you know all are familiar with Professor Ames. Very distinguished philosopher, thinkers in the broad field of Chinese studies, Chinese philosophy, comparative philosophy. He's currently the humanities chair professor at Peking U, and have, well, you might know a lot of voluminous translations, edited volume, and also monographs on Chinese thought, Chinese philosophy. And in the past 10 years, I think he further developed his thoughts on role ethics and going towards role politics and on the concept of human becomings. So instead of individual atoms, I think he tried to illustrate that we are related relational cells, and that might hopefully contribute a better understandings of like ethics and politics and how to build a new global orders for the betterment of humanities. So we're very glad to have Roger to share with us his latest thoughts on that issue. So without further ado, let's welcome Professor Ames.
Yes. I wore a tie so that everybody would know who's talking. I was saying to Shoufu that today's lecture is really important to me because at the Berggruen Research Center, we're taking a new direction. And that is that we're really keen to establish philosophy of family as a subdiscipline in philosophy. That the Berggruen Center in China is really keen to participate in sort of the grand transformations that are happening in the world, but also from a Chinese perspective. You know, what does China have to offer to a planetary sense of order? What does it have to offer to some way of stabilizing the human condition, generating solidarity, and so on? And so I hope we have a chance to really talk about this idea of 家哲学 or 家庭哲学, you know. Over the first 2 decades of the 21st century, the rise of East Asia and of China in particular has occasioned a seismic sea change in the economic and political order of the world. The tremors emanating from this newly emerging geopolitical order are testing the modern system of sovereign and equal nation states, ushered in by the Westphalian Treaty more than 3.5 centuries ago. This Westphalian model has encouraged a kind of culture of liberal individualism, with the defining values of individual autonomy and equality scaled up to an international level. And as a zero-sum game of winners and losers at an international level, it has proven to be wholly ineffective in addressing the pressing issues of our times, where the pandemic is just the first among many. Philosopher Michael Walzer, in his Thick and Thin Moral Arguments at Home and Abroad, continues to endorse a politics of difference. But at the same time, he wants to describe and defend a kind of thin, universal moral minimalism that resides within each thick and particularist morality. When Walzer talks about thick, he's talking about Hinduism and Buddhism and Islam and Ubuntu and Christianity and so on. And, you know, we have all of these thick cultural traditions, but do we have something that brings them together? Not in terms of persuasion, but acknowledgement, a kind of consensus, a shared feeling, you know, that we have something in common. So what Walzer wants from this minimalism is nothing less than a limited and yet hugely important sense of solidarity that can bring the people of the world together. And as for the substance of this thin morality, for Walzer, such minimalism does not mean minor or emotionally shallow morality. On the contrary, thinness and intensity come together for him as morality close to the bone. 接近骨子里. While Walser himself would look to a common garden variety of justice expressed in resonant rules and principles, human rights, as a possible source of this moral minimalism, I want to suggest an alternative answer to the same problem drawn from the Confucian tradition. I will argue it is a cluster of terms surrounding the prime moral imperative of family reverence, xiao, that has made family feeling not only the ground of the Confucian minimalist morality, but also the root and the substance of the living Confucian social, political, and global order that continues today. If we begin from the fact that the population of China is as large as the continent of Africa and almost twice that of a combined Eastern and Western Europe, we can appreciate the scale of the diversity that has been pursued over millennia among so many disparate peoples, languages, ways of life, modes of governance, and so on. While this diversity is truly profound, there seems to have been enough of a shared minimalist morality to hold it together as a continuous Chinese history and civilization for 4,000 years and counting. What has over time provided a sustained cultural consensus in the etymological sense of shared feelings lies in the family-based values promoted through the written Chinese character and the classics born of this writing system. Here, sort of the image, Zhao Tingyang's image of a xuanmo, of a whirlpool that has drawn into it all of this diversity that is China, and that has made it yi duo bufan, has made it one in the sense of a kind of continuing identity, while at the same time duo in the sense of all of these different kinds of people over time. So if you, in speaking Chinese, you don't say country, you say guojia. You don't say everybody, you say dajia. You don't say humankind, you say renjia. You don't say Confucian, you say rujia. In the classroom, shifu, xuejie, xuedi. The distinguished late Qing dynasty scholar Yan Fu, who translated and introduced Western liberalism into the Chinese Academy, once remarked that if we ask after the source of social and political order in imperial China over the past 2 millennia, 30% can be attributed to emperor and 70% to family, jiazu, shizu. For Confucian culture, it is the family that is the ultimate source and the indispensable ground of an achieved propriety in all of our roles and relations. The Analects makes this point explicitly. Li zhi yong he wei gui, and optimizing harmony is the most valuable function of achieving propriety in our roles and relations. In the ways of the former kings, the sustaining of this quality of harmony through achieving propriety in their roles and relations made them elegant, was a guiding standard in all things large and small. But when things are not going well, to realize harmony just for its own sake without regulating the situation through an achieved propriety in roles and relations will not work. 知和而和，不义理皆知，义不可行也。 Family, a model of order that when optimally functional is one and many at the same time, is that powerful social nexus to which members are most inclined to invest themselves utterly and without remainder. That is, persons as required are inclined to give their families their time, their fortunes, their body parts, and even their lives. Confucian philosophy promotes this institution of family with its primary moral imperative of xiao as its governing cosmological value, as a deliberate strategy to maximize the creative possibilities available within all of the human activities as they are rooted in family and extend outward socially, politically, and religiously from this resilient core. Importantly, such a commitment to family, far from entailing self-sacrifice or self-abnegation, requires the full expression of personal worth, and thus becomes that context in which one can most effectively pursue personal realization. From its origins in the prehistoric past and ever-evolving Chinese culture has been unique among the world's civilizations, both in terms of its unbroken continuity and in the rich and varied institutional, material, and conceptual artifacts its peoples have produced. Upon entering into China's past, certain major themes emerge as they are repeatedly expressed in different facets of Chinese life. One of these themes is the centrality of the family that has thoroughly permeated the socio-political, economic, metaphysical, moral, and religious dimensions of Chinese history since at least the early Neolithic period. Zhao Tingyang, a contemporary philosopher, reflects on how first setting the root and then on that basis pursuing growth is the beginning and the projected end in the Confucian way of becoming consummately human. The primary issue for the human way is that of generation and regeneration, and the first step herein is growth. This is the starting point for the evolutionary thread of Chinese thought. The doing of growth must seek what a thing lies upon to be deeply rooted and firmly planted in its growth. Therefore, growth, first of all, requires putting down roots. The two metaphors of growth and putting down roots set out the path for Chinese thought. I recently did this source book, and I don't put it up there as an advertisement, but the tree on the cover is magnificent. This is in Songyang Shuyuan in Henan province, Dangfeng, near the Shaolin Temple. There is this tree, and this tree is 4,500 years old. 4,000. We were just there last week, getting to know what Han Wudi called Da Jiangjun. He was Han Wudi. If he was Han Wendi, maybe he would have called it Da Ru. That this tree is really a magnificent symbol of the tradition. Songyang Shuyuan was first Songyang Si, then later it became Songyang Guan, and then in the Song dynasty it became Songyang Shuyuan. And so you have the Ru Shidang, San Jiao Wei Yi kind of understanding of Ru, not as Kongzi Juyi, but as a kind of literati class in every generation, from going back to the Song dynasty, Junziru, Buyao Shaorenru, that goes back to the Shang dynasty, that takes as their responsibility the Li Hua, Li Mao de Li, the elegance, the transformation of the human experience into something that is elegant, something that is refined. And so that in every generation, the content of the rule, you know, if we go back to there's a generic sense of rule and a specific sense of rule. You know, we can handle both of these. And so this tree for me is really a living symbol, like it's it's just magnificent. If you have a chance to go and see it, it really is really overwhelming. In the Confucian project of personal growth, the root must be set and firmly planted within the family itself. In reflecting on Confucian philosophy as a resource for an ecological geopolitical order, we must give full weight to the perceived isomorphism that obtains among the familial, political, and global orders as they are rooted in and emerge from a regimen of personal cultivation within the family. This same organic symbiosis is described in the Mencius. There is a popular adage heard among the people who all say, the world, the state, the family. The world is rooted in the state in the family, and the family in one's own person. 人有恒焉，皆曰天下国家，天下之本在国，国之本在家，家之本在身。 The idea that the root of governance lies in the institution of family is made explicit in the Book of Documents as one of the 5 classics. Confucius is making an astute observation when he asserts that within this cultural tradition, the proper functioning of the institution of family is integral to the production of the socio-political order of the state. Someone asked Confucius, "Why are you not employed in government?" The master replied, "The Book of Documents says it all lies in family reverence. Being filial to your parents and finding fraternity with your brothers is in fact carrying out the work of governing. In doing these things, I'm participating in governing. Why must I be employed in government?" From earliest times, family reverence has served the Confucian tradition as its prime moral imperative. Morality, as it is cultivated through the commitment to consummate conduct in one's roles and relations, Ren, is thus an extension and expression of immediate family feeling. In the Analects, we read, "Exemplary persons concentrate their efforts on the root. For the root having been properly set, the vision of the moral life will grow therefrom. As for family reverence and fraternal deference, they are, I suspect, the root of consummate conduct. 君子无本理而道生，孝悌也者，其为人之本与." In this Confucian process of world making, persons are imbricated as unique, relationally constituted perspectives within family, polity, and cosmos. Through dedication to the cultivation of deliberate growth in their relations, every person has the capacity for bringing resolution and more distinctive, meaningful focus to the roles and relations that constitute them. At the center of this personal project, the meaning of the family is implicated in and dependent upon the productive cultivation of each of the members. Then, by radial extension, the meaning of the community, polity, and the entire cosmos is in turn implicated in and ultimately derived from the cultivation of each person as a family member. When we examine the earliest form of the character for elders, Lao, as it appears on the oracle bones, we find that it depicts an old person with long, disheveled hair, leaning on a walking stick, bringing immediately to mind the famous photograph of Albert Einstein with his dandelion hair. In the small seal script, the same graph, the second one, for elders becomes stylized, anticipating its present form as Lao. In comparing this character for elders with the earliest instance of the character for family reverence, Xiao, found later on the bronzes, we discover that the image of a young person, Zi, has quite literally taken the place of the walking stick as a support upon which the elders can lean, thereby constituting this character as elders supported by their young, by their offspring. While Xiao certainly references the aid and comfort that succeeding older generations can enjoy from the progeny that succeeds them, the complement flows in the other direction as well. That is, Xiao is also the vital process whereby the members of the younger generation are transformed into and become an always novel yet persistent embodied variant of those elders to whom they have deferred. The older generation is a reservoir of culture from whom the succeeding generation can draw sustenance and meaning, and in so doing, this younger generation provides their progenitors with a conduit that allows them to live on both in the bodies and in the lived cultural experience of a continuing lineage. Quite literally, family tree. The notion of Ren being rooted in family is clear in the alternative graphic form of this character found on the bamboo strips recovered, I think, at Guodian, where the graph for Ren is composed of a woman's pregnant body with the graph heart-mind beneath it. Clearly, any conception of family must begin from woman with child, and any notion of consummatory moral conduct must have its entry point in family relations. We learn to be loved by being loved in family. Confucian ethics, in substance, is perpetuated through family lineage that have complex political, economic, and religious functions. There are two cognate characters that are integral to the dynamics of family reverence, Xiao, in the intergenerational transmission of the continuities of the family lineage, Ti, embodying body, forming and shaping category, class, and li, achieving propriety in one's roles and relations, ritual. Without the formal and determinate dimension provided by embodied living, T, and by the social grammar afforded by meaningful roles and relations, li, there is very real question as to whether the significant refinement that is aspired to through such embodied life forms would even be possible. Put simply, determinate forms in their many different variations, body, ritual, language, the institutions of family and ancestral reverence, and so on, are a necessary condition for cultural refinement. In the Confucian tradition, the body is understood as an inheritance from our families and as a vital current in a genealogical stream that reaches back to our remotest ancestors. The body brings with it a sense of continuity, contribution, belonging, and importantly, a sense of felt worth as precisely those feelings that most immediately inspire our religious sensibilities. To show respect for our own bodies, both the physical body and its function as the residence of the cultural corpus that our family lineage has bequeathed to us, is to show reverence for our ancestors embodied therein and for the relationship we have with them. Alternatively, to disrespect our bodies by treating them lightly is to be doubly shameless. We first fail to acknowledge our debt to our family lineage, and further, we bring shame instead of honor upon those who have come before. What is significant in this reflection on our embodied persons is that physically, socially, and religiously, our bodies are a specific matrix of nested relations and functions that are a collaboration between our own persons and the extended web of our many familial, social, cultural, and natural relations. The lived body and its embodied living is the narrative site of the conveyance and the continuing enhancement of the culture through which a living civilization is perpetuated, the persistence of its language, its mores and values, its religious rituals, its aesthetics of cooking, song, and dance, and so on. In Confucian ethics, the assumption is that social and political order, broadly construed, is rooted in and emerges from personal cultivation, as it is first and foremost actuated within the institution of the family and then extended to one's family lineage and beyond. Integral to this process is the transmission of a continuing cultural legacy and its institutions. In the Zhongyong, it defines xiao explicitly in such terms. Family reverence means being good at continuing the purposes of one's predecessors and at maintaining their ways. It is important to note that in promoting the family as a pervasive model of order, the Confucian worldview does not accept that hierarchical social institutions are necessarily pernicious or that simple egalitarianism should have an uncritical value. But 2 points of clarification on the idea of deference are needed here. First, we must resist any simplistic equation between family reverence and blind obedience. Family reverence focused on the bottom-up deference children owe their elders must be distinguished clearly from paterfamilias that we associate with Roman law as the juridical patria potestas, or power and privilege of the father. Indeed, there are times when being truly filial within the family, like being a loyal minister at court, requires courageous remonstrance, jian, rather than automatic compliance. I think there's a whole chapter in the Xunzi that gives accounts of this particular point. And indeed, with this doctrine of xiao, initiating such remonstrance is not perceived as a possibility or an option one might choose to exercise, but as a stern, if not sacred, obligation. On a personal level, there is also a space for self-remonstrating, built into the relational two-ness of consummate person of Ren, as it is rooted in xiao. The cultivation of a critical self-awareness and sense of shame provides a perspective from which to critique one's own roles as they are lived within family and community. We usually think of Ren in terms of external relationships, but there is also the growth of this idea of self-consciousness, that as one lives in the world, one becomes increasingly conscious of their own identity and has a conversation, has an opportunity to have a conversation with themselves. This too, I think, is really an integral part of Ren. So in the Classic of Family Reverence, chapter 15, Master Zheng, who is to become the paragon of family reverence in the Confucian tradition, after having benefited from a full 14 chapters of Confucius's instruction on xiao, asked the master explicitly if strict obedience is the substance of family reverence. Master Zheng said, parental love, reverence and respect, seeing to the well-being of one's parents and raising one's name high for posterity, on these topics I have received your instruction. I would presume to ask whether children can be deemed filial by obeying every command of their father. Confucius responds to Master Zheng's query with a disappointed impatience, making the argument that such an uncritical attitude of automatic compliance with the dictates of one's elders, far from being the substance of family reverence, can on the contrary be a source of gross immorality and conduct. What on earth are you saying? What on earth are you saying? Said the master. If confronted by reprehensible behavior on his father's part, dang bu yi, a son has no choice but to remonstrate with his father. And if confronted by reprehensible behavior on his ruler's part, a minister has no choice but to remonstrate with his ruler. Hence, remonstrance is the only response to immorality. How could simply obeying the commands of one's father be deemed filial? Xiao must become a pattern of conduct with unrelenting attention and extended out from family to include all members of the community and polity, and ultimately even to nature itself. Within the human experience, xiao is nothing less than the high value that informs us and is the motive force for the intergenerational transmission of the living cultural tradition itself. In the first chapter of the Chinese Classic of Family Reverence, it declares that family reverence begins in service to your parents, continues in service to your Lord, and culminates in distinguishing yourself in the world. Again, in chapter 7, entitled The Three Powers, Xiao has cosmic reference, correlating the relationships that attain among the heavens, the earth, and the human world, san cai, within this Xiao moral imperative. It is because these three powers are mutually implicated in each other that such cosmic relations, providing as they do a context for the human experience, have themselves a moral aspect that can serve as an isomorphic model for the proper accord aspired to in our human institutions of family and state. Incredible the profundity of family reverence, declared Master Zheng. Indeed, said the master, family reverence is the constancy of the heavenly cycles, the appropriate responsiveness of the earth, and the proper conduct of the people. It is the constant workings of the heavens and the earth that the people model themselves upon. Taking the illumination of the heavens as their model and making the most of the earth's resources, they bring the empire into accord. This is the reason that education can be effective without being severe, and political administration can maintain proper order without being harsh. In the Chinese Classic of Family Reverence, Confucius begins by elevating xiao to be Confucian philosophy's highest moral imperative, declaring that this way of family reverence is the very substance of morality and education. Fu xiao de zhi ban ye, zhao zhi suo you sheng ye. It is family reverence that is the root of moral virtuosity, and whence education itself is born. This text's emphasis upon the transformative power of education exploits the cognate relationship between the character for education, jiao, and family reverence, xiao, As we have seen, well, the graph for family reverence, xiao, itself is constituted by elder and younger. The graph for education adds to it the branch radical, zhi, suggesting perhaps that the younger generation grows from the root and trunk of the generations that have come before. Just as the Hanzi, when we talk about Hanzi, the zi of Hanzi is all about the proliferation, the progeny, the offspring, as the character generates new content. Importantly, the character jiao underscores the centrality of family reverence in the actual content and goals of proper education, just as the cognate relationship it has with emulating. Xiao emphasizes the modeling role that the elder generation has for the progeny. The Shuowen lexicon captures these associations in defining jiao as sheng suo shi, sha suo xiao ye, that which those above disseminate and those below emulate. The first tenet of familial reverence is the accountability persons have throughout their lifetime to protect the body that has been entrusted to them by their parents and ancestors, and the solemn responsibility they have to return this body to their progenitors intact. The charge in this passage to keep the body intact certainly refers to a person's own carnal physicality, but it also lends itself to an important broader cultural reading. That is, each succeeding generation has a responsibility of keeping the corpus of culture that it comes to embody whole and alive. The concluding exhortation from the Book of Songs 235 states, King culture, Wen Wang, is above how he shines in the heavens. How can you fail to remember your ancestor King Wen? You must cultivate yourself and extend his virtuosity. Reading between the lines, we might offer the following translation as what is actually being advocated in this citation. How can you fail to embody the culture of your ancestors? You must cultivate yourself and extend the reach and influence of this virtuosity. There is a primacy given to vital relationality that is exemplified by the centrality given to family reverence as the prime moral imperative. If religare, as the Latin root of religious, does mean binding tightly, 绑得很紧, as reflected in the cognate's ligament, obligation, league, and ally, then we can see that family reverence, xiao, so described has a profoundly religious import as well, referencing as it does those familial, communal, and ancestral bonds that together constitute a resilient and enduring social fabric. It is because the entry point for developing moral competence in the Confucian vision of the moral life is family relations in the broadest sense that xiao, as family reverence, has its singularly important place in the early Confucian canons. And it is this profoundly religious sense of binding tightly, that is, the strengthening of family and communal bonds, that we would appeal to in interpreting the master's autobiographical response to Zilu's question in Analects about what he would most like to do. I would like to bring peace and contentment to the aged, share relationships of trust and confidence with friends, and to love and protect the young. That is, while persons emerge to become specifically who they are as unique individuals, the parents, grandparents, and ancestors of such persons continue to live on in them, most obviously in their physicality, but also in terms of how they think, feel, and live their lives. The religious aspect of family reverence is to inform and strengthen the generational bonds within the family and to promote the intergenerational transmission of the living culture. Each generation inherits and importantly embodies the tradition from those who have come before and is responsible for building the connector between it and the generation yet to come. Perhaps most obviously in the physicality of the progenitors, but more importantly in their persistent values and way of life, they quite literally live on in their progeny, making all Chinese one family as the children of the Yellow Emperor. The living body and its embodied living is the conveyance of the cultural corpus of knowledge through which a living civilization itself is preserved and extended. And so not only like one of my preoccupations that I inherit out of the Grenet, Needham, Fritz Mote, Tang Juni, Fei Xiaotong kind of a tradition is the importance of an interpretive context, that we have to locate these texts within their own world. We can't simply read them and use a kind of Western theoretical conceptual framework to talk about the Chinese tradition. I think religion is a perfect example of that. Look at even in Baidu, you know, they have this idea that religion is to be defined in terms of some kind of a creator god, some kind of a controlling god, when this has got nothing to do with Chinese religiousness. Chinese religiousness is all about Chunjie. It's all about going home and speaking your Guangdonghua and eating your wonton and hanging out with your people, your teachers, and all the rest of it. It's sort of reinforcing your own identity as a particular participant in this world, without reference to some kind of a creator god or that sense of religiousness. You know, the eliding of Shangdi and Tian with some kind of Western concept of God is to rob this Confucian tradition of its own profound religious sensibilities. They're human-centered, they're family-centered, they're ancestor-centered. They don't have to do with some kind of causal sort of ontological structure that we inherit out of the Greek tradition. And so when we think of Confucian religiousness, this is a better picture. Going beyond this specifically Chinese historical experience and its values, what is the argument that family feeling, rather than Walser's notion of justice, can in fact be universalized to serve as the minimalist morality needed to secure the planetary commons? Can family feeling provide the solidarity needed to ground an alternative doctrine of intra rather than international relations? And perhaps most pressing, how can family feeling be practically activated to make this difference? Family is the oldest and most pervasive human institution. Families have been a source of economic strength and security in virtually every human culture, and arguably will remain such. It is doubtful that any national or transnational government will ever be able to provide adequate social welfare services that would diminish our reliance upon the institution of family for a population in a resource-shrinking and ecologically fragile world fast approaching 8 billion. Since everyone has a family, family feelings provide us the broadest possible basis for developing appropriate ethical impulses, where such feelings are themselves more primordial than thinking or feeling. The feeling of qin is more fundamental to us as human beings than thinking or reasoning. Lived roles in families and their attendant values are more effective than abstract rules and principles to the extent they provide a concrete impetus for determining what to do next. Because he is my brother is a powerful argument that does not need to be further theorized. In this way, family feeling satisfies the pragmatic requirement of beginning from specifically experienced meaning rather than from second-order concepts or theories, and thus aligns with Walser's observation that thin morality and intensity come together as morality close to the bone. As for Walser's common garden variety of justice, family is the schoolroom for such basic values, where a just society can hardly exist while injustices prevail within the families that constitute it. The argument of Susan Moeller Oken's book on justice, family, and gender. From the perspective of historical continuities, family is the institution that serves in the process of intergenerational transmission as a conduit for the ongoing embodiment of living cultural traditions. At the end of the day, while human differences have a high value as a resource for promoting cultural diversity, in order for these differences to be understood and activated, they must be informed by a more fundamental sense of a shared and situated consensus. The institution of family provides this ground. And finally, family, in underscoring the inseparability of privilege and responsibility, of entitlements and obligations, is the model of human organization that can most effectively challenge the prevailing ideology of self-interested individualism. While this alternative conception of agency is derived from family feeling, it has immediate application to corporate and political entities at a higher level of abstraction. Family teaches the wisdom of interdependence, in which a good father can only be such with a good daughter, and hence he does better when his daughter does better. The immediate implication of a relational understanding of oneself rooted in family is that if other members of your family flourish, you flourish too. And by extension, if your neighbor does better, you do better. It is thus an urgent philosophical task to inquire more deeply into the role of family feeling in the formulation of a minimalist ethic for a new geopolitical and geocultural order. Thank you.
Thanks a lot for Professor Ames, very insightful lecture. So we now open the floor to questions, comments, ideas. Yeah.
Thanks so much for that inspirational talk. I'm fully on board with this proposal that we insist, even at risk of offending people or shoehorning, on a kind of subfield in philosophy of philosophy of family. That's great. So there's so many good questions, there's so many interesting, suggestive comments here that I wanted to follow up on, but I'll stick with just one, I hope. I have to confess that I'm a bit dense when it comes to this word religion. Maybe I grew up in too naturalistic an environment or something, but so I'm kind of curious to hear more about how you understand this word religion. I certainly agree that we need a more permissive conception of religion and religiosity than the sort of one that comes to us from monotheistic religion. So we don't need a Juzai or a creator figure necessarily in order to count as having a religious attitude or a religious belief. But what exactly do you mean by religion over and against other sort of non-religious beliefs and attitudes? Sure. And then if there's a little bit of time, could you also say a little bit more about how that works to fulfill your agenda when it comes to, with respect to minimalist morality?
Right. This, there's a sort of a cross-cultural hermeneutics. We can use Emerson's Divinity School address. Emerson graduates from Harvard. There's only half a dozen new candidates for the ministry. And so he goes off and he is a minister in Boston for about 6 months, and then he gives it up. He says, I can't do this. I got to give up the ministry in order to minister. And so he goes off, and about 4 years later, he's invited back to Harvard to give the commencement address to the half a dozen graduating students. And the old Q-tips, the old professors, white-headed professors, are sitting at the back of the room. Q-tips, yeah, from my son. And so he gives them this lecture that so scandalizes the Divinity School that he's not invited back to Harvard, as famous as he becomes, until after the Civil War, until some 30-odd years later. And what he says is, that historical Christianity has two fundamental defects. The first defect is the idea that Jesus is a God. That if you do that, then you make Jesus into something that has very little to do with a human being. The whole idea is that Jesus is a man, And so the function of Jesus, the historicization of Christianity, is to give us a bangyang, to give us a kind of a model for somebody who, like a Buddha or like a Confucius or like Mohammed, is transformative in the world. And so, that for Emerson, and Dewey following Emerson too, that for Emerson, institutionalized religion that wants us all to be the same, that wants us to have all the same values, to have the same festivals, to have the same ways of life and the same habits and so on. For him, far from being a source of religiousness, this is oppressive, This smothers religion. Religion is about each of us stepping up and trying to be a Jesus, trying to be a shofu, that changes the world in the same degree as Jesus does. And that's, in many ways that resonates. Think of the Confucian tradition, Renjia, Junzi, Shengren, that, and each one of these, Renjia, everybody's a different Renjia. Junzi, everybody's a different Junzi. Shengren, everybody's a different Shengren. That the idea of aspiring to that kind of difference in the world is for Emerson, and I think for the Confucian tradition, a source of a different kind of religiousness, a powerful kind of religiousness. The second defect, just to not let it slip away, is that God is not about Sinai. God is not about 2,000 years ago in the desert. That God is about a person, speaking from their heart, from, preaching blood, bringing people along, attracting people to a higher level of living by virtue of their passion, and leave sort of the historical behind and get into what real religion means. And so Emerson gives this address, and the Boston papers are full of criticism of somebody who would speak out against the church in that manner. So my way of thinking, like if we think it through, like I think what we have to do, and I'm sure people are thinking through. I don't do religion, but I'm sure people are thinking it through. But when you think of Ji Se in the Chinese tradition, where does the language come from? You go to Anyang, Wenzi Berggruen, and Jiagu Wen, there's 5,000 characters. An educated Chinese person can't recognize 5,000 characters. That's a robust, redundant language. We can't read them all, but that's a language, and this language comes out of the need for human beings to contribute, to communicate with those who have come before them. And then there's the proliferation. When you think of the moral vocabulary, think of ren yi de yi, is a yang zapang, yang zapang. 下面有一个我. The war is a serrated knife to kill the sheep. That so many of the vocabularies come out of this idea of ancestral sacrifice.
Hi, Roger. Thanks for, as Justin said, quite an inspiring presentation. Now, you were focusing, when you're working with this English concept of family feeling, you were focusing on the Chinese concept of xiao. But when you talk about this issue, a passage that often comes to my mind is the passage in MACHS Jinxin Pian about Liang Zhi and Liang Nang. And of course, that passage says that it draws some sort of very strong association between qin, your qin feeling toward your parents is ren, right? And jingzhang, this sort of respectful or admiring feeling toward your elder family members, your brothers, is somehow very closely associated with yi, right? And then the line goes on and says, 无他, 达着天下也. So I'm curious and would like to kind of invite you to expand on this idea that your concluding point here about how the role of family feeling could fit into a kind of minimalist ethic. When the Mengzi talks about taking those two attitudes that we inherently have and seeing their connection to those moral attitudes, and all we've got to do is somehow 达着天下, extend it to all the world. What's your vision of how you might unpack or elaborate on that process of transforming the family feeling into a minimalist ethic outside of the family?
No, that's really good. Like the point that I want to make first is that I would take the story of China to be a concrete historical example of how family feeling has been the minimalist morality that has kept a particular population together across the millennia. So, but that doesn't mean that Confucians have to go to Italy and persuade Italians, you really should care about family, like Italian Sunday dinners are sort of very famous, and Ubuntu, the in Africa, you don't need that the argument is that 回家, that we have to come back to this understanding of ourselves, that liberal values, autonomy and freedom and equality and rationality and choice and so on, this cluster of terms is very powerful in the world, but it only belongs to a relatively small population that maybe 80% of the world's population see themselves in the world in a way that is much closer, I think, to the Confucian tradition than to the liberal tradition. And so my sense of it is that, philosophers, we always worry, that, we're eggheads and that we don't make a difference, and that, we theorize and we have conferences and we talk a lot and we publish books and so on, but we don't make a difference. But when you think of something like green, like when I was a kid, green was nothing. And today, green is really an important idea. And so, to have philosophy, sort of pursue and explore, through a kind of comparative cultural hermeneutics, that metaphysics is really different if you think of family. You've got ontology, in classical Greece, and that's all about on, and that doesn't have very much to do with family. But you've got sheng sheng lun in the I Ching, sheng sheng bu yi, sheng sheng zhi tian sheng zhi tian di zhi da de yue sheng. You've got a kind of sheng sheng lun in the Chinese tradition. So you've got a different first philosophy. If you go from metaphysics to ethics, then you instead of deontology and all of the other Western theories where the assumption is that Confucianism's encounter with the Western tradition is its defining moment, then all of a sudden it becomes theoretically ethical, but to use its own vocabulary and give role ethics or something else that where ethics is spoken in its own vocabulary, religion. And so my way of thinking, like we're having a meeting at Beida at the end of December, and the whole idea, the theme of the meeting is a method and a framework, formulating a method and a framework for philosophy of family. And so my sense of the framework would be to look at professional philosophy and the categories of professional philosophy and think about how each one of them, politics. We were talking about, think of the ruler in Xunzi, in Mengzi, is the fumu of the people, is the parents of the people, and the responsibility of the ruler is to be a model, to the people and to make sure that the people are educated properly which means educated on li, on family. And then you won't have old people carrying bundles on the street. You know, we all know the passages. So if we think through our logic goes from being a kind of demonstration of truth to an explanation, a generative logic, an explanation of an abductive logic, an explanation of how things take shape, you know, a different way of thinking about logic. And so family, I think, you know, can really stimulate us to just as the Confucian tradition challenges us to think of religiousness in a different way, can challenge us to expand upon the way in which we conceive of the discipline of philosophy and see it in a different way.
Thank you for this wonderful talk. I'm really sympathetic to your view that family is an essential, really important part of a culture that weaves generations of the community together. So xiao is something that can go back to the ancestors, and then that's something we transmit to future generations. So really like this idea, but I think it's part of, you know, historical change, historical continuity, as you mentioned. And then I was wondering how your account can also account for historical change or cultural change. I asked this question because, like for my generation, you know, those generations younger than me, I think lots of Chinese, they either, you know, straightforwardly reject xiao, or they have a radical different interpretation of it. You know, they refuse to get married. They don't want to have children. And then there will be no possibility of family or lineage. And also, and because of one child policy, lots of children, they live in large cities, so they can't afford to take care of their elderly parents in proximity, and so on. So there are lots of problems there. So I was wondering whether xiao is robust enough to accommodate these changes. Thank you.
Yeah, where's Pei? Yeah, the idea of retrofitting these ideas, I think, is really important. There was you know, Zhang Shenglong has a book called Jia Yu Xiao that Kevin translated into English and is just coming out with SUNY Press. And I sat down, like Zhang Shenglong was an old friend of mine forever, and we spent a whole afternoon arguing, and then we did it again at a conference, where his idea was really that same-sex marriage is not Confucian. That in China, there's an awful lot of very conservative Confucians. And I was arguing with him. He was saying, you know, you're trying to sneak liberal values into our Confucianism. And I said, I don't think so. Like, when you think of the most fundamental Confucian values, I would say he is not harmony. He is youhua gongxiang tixi, is a kind of optimizing symbiosis. It's trying to get the most out of your ingredients. The reason why jia is the governing metaphor is because we give everything to jia. If you want to get the most out of people, 你不要平天下，要家天下。This is Wang Chong, you know, Wang Chong in the Han Dynasty says, 我们要家天下, to make it into a family. I gave a lecture at Yuelu Shuyuan in Changsha, and there was a woman who stood up in the audience, and she said, you know, I'm 33. I don't want to get married. I don't want to have kids. I got my life. I got my art. I got my friends. I got my world. She said, you know, you go on with your romantic Confucian xiao, this idea, and family. She said, does your Confucianism have room for me? And so I said, if it doesn't, it's not my Confucianism. You know, that what Confucianism is fundamentally is this idea of optimizing symbiosis, gongxiang, you know, kyosei, getting the most out of your ingredients. It's about baorong, inclusiveness. It's about 无边界, of no boundaries. It's about 和. It's about 变通. And, things like misogyny, gender prejudice, that doesn't fit those values. 女子有小人难养, is it, I mean, this is obviously misogynistic. And you can, I go to conferences where the conservative Confucian philosophers are trying to sort of play that, and, in this particular context, Shaoren or 女子 means little girls. And Shaoren, just means, I mean, they try to give some kind of an explanation to explain away, but it's misogynistic. But Confucius is the Junzi makes mistakes, doesn't have all the right values. We can fit that, but in our time, if Confucianism is going to survive, we need a progressive Confucianism. We need an evolutionary Confucianism, 进化型的一个 Confucianism, not simply the old Confucianism that we've had. The family is a good example. Jiazu, Yan Fu is talking about Jiazu. We don't have Jiazu anymore. But what you've got is you've still got those same values diffused in society in a different way. Chinese classrooms are familial, I mean, my feeling in a Chinese classroom is parental, and I didn't see that in any place in my American experience except the University of Hawaii, and maybe it's because at the University of Hawaii, everybody when my son's friends come to my house, they don't call me Mr. Ames, they don't call me Roger, they don't call me Professor Ames, they call me uncle. And auntie, there's auntie, that auntie and uncle is the language because we're 70% Asian and Pacific Islanders in Hawaii. And that culture becomes part of the department, part of the classroom. And so in Hawaii, my experience was that too, was like China, a kind of family institution. And so even though Jiazu is gone, there's an opportunity to take those same values and retrofit, our terminologies in such a way that they fit the modern world. Uh-oh, now I'm in trouble.
I'm completely, or 98.9% on your side. And just to support what you say, I love this idea that family well-being is crucial for human well-being. And it's striking that the global indices that measure well-being, I did some research a few years ago, none of them include family well-being. I mean, it's, they rank countries according to how well you're doing, but none of them include as a standard family well-being. So I completely on board that there's something wrong here and that we need to include it. But then I was thinking, if you do want to persuade some people that family well-being is a kind of universal and we should use that as a standard for improvement and for ranking societies, how well they're doing. But there's how do we respond? This is a question to you, sympathetic, because I'm completely on your side. But, I mean, how do we respond to, people from different traditions, like, I don't know, maybe Buddhism, please forgive me, this is vulgarization of Buddhism, that we should strive to strip ourselves from particularistic attachments, including attachments to the family, or existentialists, who, again, vulgarization, that hell is other people, or even Christians, who say that, we should be attached more to God and so on rather than the family. I mean, or not to mention libertarians, who are really individualistic. I mean, how do we respond to say, well, we shouldn't have family? Like maybe Walter's onto something, when he says for him the universal human rights are the really thin human rights, negative ones, torture's bad, slavery's bad, don't kill innocent people, genocide is bad. We can all agree on that. But can we really all agree on family well-being when there's so many traditions out there that seem to devalue family well-being? That's one question. And the other is, we also need to respond that there's so many bad families out there, So, I mean, you present families, that's all, but as you, it's not an original point. Oh, sorry. I stole her question. Yeah, how do you respond to the fact that there's so many shitty families out there?
Taking the second one first. I think that's true. Like I mentioned, Susan Moeller Oken, who did this book on, it's justice, gender, and family. Where maybe if I were going to write it, I would want it to be family, gender, and justice. That you want to come out of practice. You don't want to start with something theoretical. But I think she really does pose the problem properly, and that is that the way in which we do family today is so saturated with gender prejudice that and family is the schoolroom of justice. And so how can you get a just society out of a world that does family so badly? And I think the problem is properly put. That's the problem that you're saying, that you're pointing out. And I think it's absolutely right. But her remedy is to degender ourselves, get rid of gender. But that's diminishing the human experience. That's not, and if you buck nature, you really go wrong. The Catholic Church has got to understand that. Don't buck nature. You got to go along with nature. And so I would say that we simply have to do family better. And doing family better is reinventing the family and taking a concept like xiao and making sure that the way in which we reconceive it functions effectively to promote the better kind of family. I always took Confucian ethics to be preemptive. Like if you take something like our current situation where you have spousal abuse. And so a woman goes along to the police station and says, I think my husband's going to kill me. And then, so what recourse does she have? The policeman's going to say, well, go home, and when he kills you, we'll deal with it. I mean, you get this kind of some kind of a legal, document that says he can't come within, but that's not going to work. But I think that the Confucian tradition is really preemptive in promoting a way of being in the world where spousal abuse is minimized. It's still going to be there, but there are sort of safety. There's something built into the system that dissuades people from that kind of extreme. So I think that so the idea that we have bad families, right? Let's do them better. And what we need a critical approach to. I mean, Confucianism has never lived up to its possibilities. We don't want to forget we don't want to forget Kang You-wei and Tan Zitong and people who really saw decadent family as being a source of pain in the Chinese tradition, but it was also something that enabled this immense population across time to continue in a very important, very significant way. And then the other point about I had really a good conversation with some Muslims about that, about the cost of transcendence. Like if you have a concept of God that is more important than your family, doesn't that come at a cost? And they said they have to think about that. I think that's right. And to challenge, Emerson was a religious man, but Emerson wanted to construct his Christianity in a way that was consistent with a different way of thinking about religiousness. And so I think that what we have to do is we have to think through critically and have conversations with people who have very different ways of living their lives, and seeing whether or not, when I travel in America and I give a talk like that, I can see in the faces of my audience that they're really angry, you know, that in their faces you can see them saying, we care about family too, you know, that's what they're saying, that family is so fundamental that people respond in that way to it. And so I think the conversations are precisely what we need. And that's why the idea of 家庭哲学, 亲情哲学 might be a good idea.
Thank you for this insightful talk. And I basically agree with everything you said. And just one quick question, that if we wanted to make family feeling globally applicable, probably it feels thinner than what we felt in mainland China. Just one example, in many other cultures that values family feelings as well, they won't have similar like policies. Like in 曲服, they said 干部不孝不可以提拔. If you're not have respect your parents, you cannot be promoted. It's something very typical in China, but we cannot see that in those other like Italians or Jewish countries. That you don't have things similar like that. So is there like a spectrum of filial piety that is thicker when it's closer to like China or say Confucian influenced area, and it will be thinner towards like can be extended to other?
I think one of the virtues of Confucianism is that it's not institutionalized, it's not formalized. Like when Li Guanyao in Singapore brought in Du Weiming and Yu Yingshi and so on, and tried to make Confucianism into a schoolroom catechism, that really doesn't fit Confucianism. And I think when you do things like you codify xiao into law in a coercive way, as opposed to persuasive way, I think you can, if you promote, and I mean that was part of the Xunzi, the Mengzi. The idea was to, when it came to education of the population, it was education on these same values. And if you do that, if those values are part of the education system, then the law is always an admission of communal failure. Like the application of law is necessary. There are people who are going to do bad things, and law has to be a backup. But if you can, within the Confucian paradigm, if you can achieve social and political order without invoking the law, that's the better model. I mean, we get that out of the Analects. It's not that Confucius is not realistic. He's quite aware of the fact that we're going to have to. We need law, but to educate the people on Li, to educate the people on these values, and it seems to me, that there's a lot of effort within China still today that looks to do that. Like we have moral education at Beida, you're not going to get that in an American university. The idea that professors are responsible for making their students moral, I don't think so. You're not going to get away with that. Somebody's going to call you on that one. That belongs to the church. That belongs to the family. We don't send our kids to school for somebody to indoctrinate them on, and yet it's really not true. The students are very much affected by the values of the teachers. That's just true. That's the case. Just one point. I have a colleague at Beida named Lu Xiaoyu. And he's a very interesting guy. He's in the international relations department. And what this guy does is really, very interesting and very dangerous. He goes around the world to places that are in crisis and lives with the people and tries to theorize what is going on when people are most desperate in the world. And so he was in Syria. Recently, he was in the Ukraine. He's in Gaza, you know. And his argument, like I talked to him about, and I've got to remember to put his name on the list for this meeting in December, that he says that what holds people together under the most desperate situations is family. That's the last straw. If you take that away from them, then they've lost the reason to live. That their sense of family is a powerful feeling that keeps them going under the most desperate circumstances.
Hi, Professor. Thank you very much for your inspiring lecture today. Actually, I'm a student from translation, not philosophy. So I may ask a question more related to cross-cultural communication. As we all know that translate philosophy is very challenging, especially when we translate Chinese philosophy into English, because Chinese philosophy itself is very metaphysical and abstract, and sometimes it's almost very difficult or even impossible for us to find the exactly equivalent or same word in English language. Like we can translate 和 into harmony. It's acceptable, but if we take it from the perspective of philosophy, they're not exactly the same. And not to mention the grammatical structure, the discourse in Chinese classics, the totally different writing systems. And you've also mentioned before that the formalist interpretation of these key Chinese terms may lead to a problem that the English readers could assume Chinese philosophy under the scope of Western philosophy. Which is a misunderstanding to some extent about Chinese philosophy. And I find that comes to a dilemma when we translate Chinese philosophy into English. So my question is that based on your experience about translate or explain Chinese philosophy into English, whether you found that these two totally different languages do share a common ground in philosophy to make this text translatable, or do you think that the communicative effect of philosophical translation is still very limited because or it is still at the linguistic level rather than the philosophical level? Because we all know that philosophy is highly rooted in culture and even the language. Yeah. Thank you.
Let me give you an example of the problem as I see it. Saussure gives us a distinction between langue and parole. And we don't want Saussure's structuralism, but we can still borrow his categories. Langue is the idea that every culture produces over time, produces categories that capture its most important values. And that these are different. And so in China, you have terms like Tian and Dao and Yi and Ren. And we have to allow that European languages don't have these terms. You don't have de, you know, we don't have terms. And so, but we have parole. And parole is the power of the natural language to say whatever we want to say. And so we can speak English or German, and we can talk about Tian, and we can get really clear on what Chinese people mean by Tian. And we can speak Chinese, and we can get really clear on what Abrahamic people mean by the aseity of God, of divine command theory, and so on. We can get really clear. So it's not incommensurability. It's just that our languages, we have to respect the fact that Chinese culture has its own language. And so if we're going to allow the tradition to speak on its own terms, then we have to get those terms right. Now, what is the standard translation of the term Ren? Benevolence. Okay, what is benevolence? Benevolence is the ethics of Jesus. The example that is used to explain benevolence is the Good Samaritan. The Good Samaritan is a story about a man, a Jew, who's beaten up and left in a ditch for dead. They've taken his money, they've taken his clothes. And so a Jewish priest walks by, sees the man in the ditch, goes to the other side of the street and carries on. A Levite goes by, another Jewish sect goes by, sees the man in the ditch, crosses the road and goes by. A Samaritan, who's sort of a marginal figure, a marginal sect within that world, sees the man in the ditch and goes and tends to his wounds and carries him to a hotel and says to the innkeeper, here's some money, take care of the man, get him clothes, give him food. If it costs more, next time I'm by, I'll give you the money. So that's the story. But in that story, there's the language of pity. There's the language of charity. There's Gao Xia, that Jesus is a God, and Jesus is doing that there's the right thing to do. And the Jewish priest didn't do it, and the Levite didn't do it, but the Samaritan did what is right under those circumstances. There's the language of treat your neighbor as yourself. That's not Confucianism. Confucianism is treat your neighbor as your neighbor. Yao shu, zhong shu zhi dao, is I have to know what you want before I can formulate what I'm going to do. I can't treat you like myself. That's disrespectful. That Confucianism is not li ta, it's li wo li ta, ji yu li or li ren. That it's focusing on the relationship and growing the relationship. And so when we use the word benevolence, then we are talking to an audience that understands Confucianism in a way that sort of misses it. But the problem is just not Lao Wai, you know, that I look at all of the Chinese, like Chinese scholars, typically, I saw I just read an interview that I did for some Chinese newspaper. And they said that I was complaining about the use of language, the use of words like benevolence and righteousness and so on. What the Chinese scholars do is they understand that ren is ren and yi is yi, but when they are writing in English, they just put it in there because they think that that's the placeholder. That's what Western people think. That, you know, when they have ren, there's a formula of translation, so we just stick it in there. You know, and what that does is it reinforces this kind of Christianized understanding of the Confucian tradition. And so I think, you know, a major problem is to focus on these terminologies, understand them, and through a kind of comparative cultural hermeneutics, separate them and give the Confucian tradition its own voice, its own terms.
Hello, thank you so much for the talk. I'll echo what was said at the beginning, very inspiring. And what I want to ask about critically is not the very inspiring Confucian story, but in the spirit of the talk, the sort of the Western theory that was used to introduce it. And this Walzer, is it?
Walzer.
Walzer, yeah. This idea that we need a minimalist morality at all. And yeah, I mean, it's something I also question and wonder about, I suppose, in terms of international relations. But part of me thinks that it's the need for a minimalist shared something is a misunderstanding.
Mm-hmm.
Epistemologically or ontologically, you can't have identity without difference, just in a kind of very simple dialectical sense. And so just talking to someone or doing any work of translation or whatever will always already include a unity, a shared something. And I'm worried that articulating that shared something into some sort of minimalist framework will actually distort it, because the sharedness is just going to be there just by virtue of you being able to perceive or talk to or whatever another. And of course, there's going to be misunderstandings. But I'm wondering if maybe to just, have something like jia as the Chinese model that is one in a plurality of voices dialoguing with each other to make the world a better place on the global stage. Do we need a minimalist morality at all?
Yeah.
As you can tell, maybe I'm a bit Taoist on this, and I can already critique myself in saying, well, the opinion that we need a minimalist morality is one among many opinions. So, yeah, but
the volume in which this paper is included, and Walser's paper is included as well, it will come out in February from the University of Hawaii Press on minimalist morality. And two very good papers in the volume are by Hans-Georg Müller and by the same man, Lu Xiaoyu. Both of them are making your point, and that is that their idea is that pursuing some kind of a universalist morality, even in the terms that Walser wants. Like Walser is really careful. He's really trying to say, I'm not talking about people having the same thing. I'm not talking about somebody persuading somebody else that they should buy into what I think. What he's trying to do is he's trying to say, let's talk about some kind of a consensus. Can't we acknowledge that in Christianity, we care about family, in Islam, we care about family, and so on. Can't we at least get that? And but your point is well taken, and that is there's an underlying assumption, and that is that sort of the disruption that we find in the human experience is somehow unnatural, and that somehow we should try to do something about it rather than allowing the fact that we disagree and try to figure out how to get on without trying to pull it all together on one axis. My own thought, like when I like the term Tang Juni, uses this idea of yi duo bu fen as an underlying I Ching cosmological postulate, the inseparability of one and many. And that idea for me is really is the best we can get if we're looking for yi tianxia guan tianxia. If we're looking for something that we can share as a planetary order where we recognize that the yi is simply a function, is the unsummed totality of the duo. It's Tao. It's not universe. It's a pluriverse. It's not a cosmos. It's cosmoi. It's many in one at the same time, and so that's I'm trying to think that Walser is trying to allow for that sense of overcoming the ambiguity of one and allowing one to be simply continuity among difference, as opposed to something that we all share.
Hi, Professor. Thank you very much for the inspiring talking. I have a question about the relationship between filial piety and education. So in Mengzi 4a18, there is a chapter that mentions, suggests the parents should not directly teach their children by themselves.
Mm-hmm.
And they argue that, so in ancient times, the families, they exchange the children
Right.
and to do the education. So how to understand this chapter of Mengzi within your argument? Thank you very much.
I think it's a good one. I mean, in that passage is really an interesting one to talk about. I remember in 2001 when I was at Beidang teaching, and Jim came over for dinner on a Friday night, and the day before I'd been talking to my son, and we had been talking politics. I think 9/11 had just happened and so on. And so we were talking about it. And then the next day when Jim came over, I was talking to somebody else, but I could hear out of the corner of my ear that Austin was saying exactly what I was saying the night before to Jim. And so I think we have to allow that we teach our kids, like with our conduct and with our values, with our language, and that all of that is true. But at the same time, there's this idea of the centrifugal circle, that a Confucian education starts in the home with the mother and expands, and that at some point you need to bring in resources from outside, that simply maintaining that limited familial reservoir is not sufficient. And so I think Mencius is making a good point, that we get in Hawaii, like it's really important for kids in Hawaii to go outside. You can't stay in Hawaii and get educated. You have to get outside as well and then come home. And I think there's that part of it. I think very often these points, philosophically, the Chinese tradition is not expository. It's not Aristotle that says, sit down, get your pen, and I'm going to tell you the way it is. That I think is trying to make a point. A watch pot never boils. That is empirically false. I've watched pots and they boil, But that point is making a point, be patient, don't push, don't pull, it's making a point. And I think that Mencius is making a point. If we read the Tao Te Ching, sometimes Shangren are good guys. Sometimes Shangren are bad guys, It's not expository, it's making a point. So we have to try to figure out what point is being made.
Thank you, Roger. As you were talking, I was thinking about Ohana. So I totally agree with you. But the one thing that keeps bubbling behind me is the idea of adopting this particular philosophy of family, Ohana. Does that mean that we have to give up the idea of agency, individualism, and also ego?
Yeah.
Where can you help us to think through this?
Yeah, very, very good. I was my seminar on Monday was exactly that. Like we were looking at Sun Chang-chan and his attempt to retrofit Heidegger and make Heidegger, instead of being in the world, being between generations, instead of being thrown into the world, being born into family. And so he's retrofitting. And so my question to the students was, does that mean that we have to give up on the liberal vocabulary? And so I said, is there a way of understanding autonomy and freedom and equality and choice that is consistent with this alternative? And I think that is really important for the question about how do we go about communicating? Daniel Bell's question, how do you go about communicating this to other people? You take something like autonomy. Our usual sense of autonomy is that it's agency is one person acting on, as a self-legislating person. But can't you have a relational autonomy? If a Junzi is among us, and the Junzi's model is persuasive, so that everybody is doing what the Junzi does, but in a non-coercive way, that nobody's making them do it. They're just doing it. Isn't that also a kind of autonomy, that this particular group of people has a relational autonomy? The idea of simple equality, again, offends against empirical experience. The idea that things are equal that's not true, And what that does, if we're talking about ethics and so on, you've got to be an adult, rational person in order to start talking about this stuff. But what about relational equity? What about the fact that my granddaughter, Sophia, should have a glass of milk to make her bones grow strong, and Grandpa Roger should have a glass of wine at night in order that he can get a good night's sleep? Now, don't give Sophia the wine, and don't give Grandpa the milk. He doesn't want it. But there's a more complex way of thinking about equality that reconciles the problem of hierarchy and equality. That Grandpa and Sophia are in a hierarchical relationship. But that kind of equity of her getting what she needs and Grandpa getting what he needs is a much better way of thinking about equality. Freedom, the idea that you can do whatever you want, that's kind of a shallow understanding of freedom. Freedom as full participation in the family and the communities that we belong to is a much more interesting understanding of freedom, And so I think that you can, that's why I was talking about how with this idea of philosophy of family, one framework for trying to figure it out would be to go to the standard ways in which we talk about the different branches in philosophy and try to think them through in such a way that we can find a contrast between a world that doesn't, look at the history of Western philosophy. Hegel's got a real interesting turn on family, but that's the only, there's very few philosophers in the Western tradition ever do anything with family. Simply not a paradigm. And yet in the Chinese tradition, you have this isomorphism of Jia Guo Tian Xia Tong Go, that this isomorphism is everywhere. And so how do we go about, sort of thinking through these differences? I think we can take the liberal vocabulary and we can retrofit it so that it can express a Confucian sensibility.
Maybe we should have the last question. Anyone want to ask? So we have several. Yeah.
Hello, Professor. And today's lecture is very helpful for us to know the Chinese traditional culture. And also, I have not a question, but I'd like to know, I have seen your very important breakthrough is that you create a new translation method. And here in your translation, here is the introduction and the keywords terminology, and then the Chinese to English version, and then it's appendix, and it is different from the Chinese to English version we have seen because it's directly the Chinese to English version. And I'd like to know what make you to create this kind of new translation methods, because in China and some most books from Chinese to English, it is rarely to see this kind of new method. And in what make you just to come up with this very, I think, maybe effective for foreigners to know the Chinese culture? Thank you.
Right. So here we are. There. What I did when I was doing this, so you got a lexicon and you got a source book. And my first concern is that we're using this kind of benevolence, righteousness language. Righteousness means to conduct yourself according to the will of God. We don't use righteousness in ordinary English parlance. You go to church and then the word righteousness might come up, when somebody's reading the Bible or something, We don't usually use the word righteousness because it belongs to that part of the human experience. And so what I try to do is I try to suggest that we should think through these terms and try to arrive at a better way of understanding them. But the ultimate goal is that, it's Wittgenstein. Wittgenstein says that the limits of our language are the limits of our world. If a student is serious about learning Chinese philosophy, if they are serious about learning Chinese philosophy, I teach Greek philosophy. I don't do classical Greek, but I know nomos and phusis and aletheia and soma, and I know sort of the key Greek philosophical terms. Theoria is really interesting, you know, and it doesn't have anything to do with the theoretical, you know. These terms are really interesting and important. And so if a student is really serious about understanding Chinese philosophy, then Tian is Tian and Dao is Dao. And that's where they have to go. And so the whole source book, the whole idea is to try to get them to that place, to all through the text. Whenever you find a key philosophical term, you have the romanization of the term, pinyin, you have the Chinese character. And then the student has to, step by step, develop an understanding of the terms. So when they go and read somebody else's translation, they see the term benevolence and they say, oh, ren. And then they read it in a way that is consistent with the Chinese tradition. And so that's the goal. Yeah.
Okay, so because of limited time, I think we'll stop here and let's welcome Professor Ames again. Yeah.